Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to Finlandia, to the frozen bog country north of Turku, where the Hakkapeliitta cavalry patrol the edge of the known world. This is the account of Johannes Falk Koskela, a veteran of 11 years in the northern circuits, and one patrol in the summer of 1914 that he has never been able to leave behind. Something was found in that country. Something was caged and carried and brought south. Koskela intercepted that column. He should have let it pass. This is the Hakkapeliitta and the iron cage. In summer, the Finlandia bog country north of Turku is almost beautiful, if you can tolerate the smell and the flies and the particular quality of the light through the pine canopy that makes everything look like it is happening inside amber. The peat is deep and black, and the water stands in pools between the hummocks of pale grass, and in July the mosquitoes rise in columns that look from a distance like smoke from small fires. The horses hate it. Not just the insects, though the insects are bad enough, thick enough to darken the air at dawn and dusk, but something deeper, some animal revulsion at the proximity of the Hellgate. You can feel it in the way they move, even the steady ones, even the veterans who have carried their riders through worse than bog country. They move with their ears forward and their eyes wide, reading the ground differently than they do in clean country. They know something is wrong with this place. They have always known. Hela had been carrying me for 6 years by the summer of 1914. She was a gray mare, not large, but deep through the chest, with a steadiness under fire that I had never seen in another horse. She wore 15 holy icons on her bridle and 4 on her saddle. More than any other horse in my patrol, not because I was superstitious. I am not a superstitious man. I am a practical man. I believe in what works. But because proximity to the Hellgate does things to horses that proximity to ordinary warfare does not. And in the 3 years I had been riding the northern circuits, I had lost 2 horses to what the older riders called the marbendil, the things that came up out of the corrupted water at night, and took animals that were not properly warded. I was not going to lose Hela to something that could be prevented by spending a few ducats on copper-backed icons at the Turku market. She was too good a horse for that kind of stupidity. We were 12 that morning, riding the ridge country above the Kokemäki watershed in the 3rd week of July. 12 Hakkapeliittas on a 3-day patrol circuit, the standard northern sweep that took us up to within 40 kilometers of the Hellgate perimeter before turning south again. We had done this route 30 times or more between us. We knew the ground. We knew what we were looking for. We found it from the ridge above Sarpola marsh. I was riding point with Risto, my best outrider, when we crested the low, pine-covered ridge and saw the column below us in the valley. I held up a fist, and we stopped without a word, the horses holding still despite the flies, and I took out my field glass and spent 2 minutes reading what was in front of me before I turned back to the patrol. It was a heretic force in retreat. I knew the direction of travel immediately. They were moving north. Not south, back toward the Hellgate, not away from it. That was the first thing. The second thing was the speed. They were moving slowly, far too slowly for a military column that knew it was in faithful territory. And that slowness had the quality not of deliberate caution, but of impairment. Through the glass, I could see the nearest figures clearly enough to note the heaviness of their movement. The way some of them stumbled on ground that was not uneven. Some of the column were moving badly. There were perhaps 15 of them scattered among the infantry, identifiable by the absence of uniform and the quality of their gait. And they moved with a lurching, disconnected heaviness that reminded me, unpleasantly, of a man I had seen once with a severed spinal cord trying to walk on willpower alone. There were perhaps 40 soldiers in total. Half were what I would call ordinary heretic infantry, the faithful's enemies carried by the same fundamental war as us, soldiers following orders in a cause they believed in, however wrong that cause was. Some wore the insignia of the northern legions, the scorched earth brigades that had been pushing south from the Hellgate perimeter all spring. Others wore no insignia at all, just dirty field gray with cult marks of various sorts scrawled in black ash on their helmet rims. Among them, stumbling and being prodded forward by the soldiers around them, were half a dozen figures in rags, the wretched, slave soldiers run in front of the line to absorb fire and tire the enemy. Some of the most wretched specimens of humanity I had seen in 11 years of war. The wretched were doing nothing useful. They were simply being herded along with the rest, mad-eyed and moving their mouths in what I assumed was speech, or prayer, or some internal monologue that had nothing to do with the column around them. A tank had bogged down at the edge of the marsh, its iron wheels sunk to the axles in black peat, and 24 soldiers were working around it in a disorganized effort to free it. They had laid planks. The planks had sunk. They were now debating what to do about the sunk planks. The urgency with which they debated this was visible even from 300 meters. Among the vehicles, 2 horse-drawn carts and the tank, there was one thing that did not fit. On one of the carts, covered with a canvas tarpaulin, was a large iron cage. It was perhaps 2 meters long and 1.5 meters high, the bars thick as a man's thumb, bolted together with the kind of care you took when you expected the contents to test the construction. 4 soldiers stood around it. Only 4. But they stood with their backs to the cage, facing outward, and they stood still while everything around them moved, which told me the guarding of the cage was a serious duty, taken seriously by serious men, which told me the cage mattered. That was what I saw from the ridge. I turned to the patrol. Paavo was already beside me. He had read the terrain as fast as I had because he was that kind of soldier, the kind whose competence was so ingrained it barely registered as thought. He was 28 years old and had been riding the Northern Circuit for 4 years. He said quietly that the column looked sick. I said I'd noticed. I said we were going down. We did not discuss tactics beyond the basics because we did not need to. The ridge gave us cover and the element of surprise and the high ground, and the patrol had ridden together long enough that each man knew what to do in a downhill charge on a disorganized enemy column. Risto took 3 men wide to the left to cut off the north end of the column. I took the rest down the slope at a canter that broke into a gallop over the last 100 meters, and we hit them at the point where the bogged tank had broken the column's cohesion into 2 loose groups, arguing about different problems. They were slow. That was the thing that struck me, even in the violence of those first 30 seconds. They were so slow. Heretic infantry could fight well. I had lost men to heretic infantry who fought the way professionals fight, with economy and precision and an understanding of firepower and angle. These men moved like they were pushing through water. By the time the first shots were fired in our direction, 3 of their number were already down, and we were among them, and the afflicted among them, who in better health might have fought with a frenzied ferocity, were simply not moving fast enough to engage us effectively. I shot one at 12 meters and put my saber through another at 6 and came out the far side of the main group into open ground without taking a scratch. The tank crew abandoned their vehicle and ran for the tree line at the marsh's edge. Risto's group caught them before they reached the trees. I did not watch that. I was pulling Hala around for a second pass at the main body. The second pass was not necessary. It was over in 4 minutes, which was fast even by our standards. The ground was littered with heretic dead and a few wounded, who were not going to last long, and the 2 carts, standing where they had been left when their drivers fell. The wretched had scattered in all directions at the first shot, most of them running for the marsh and the tree line. Mad and mindless, and dangerous only in the sense that a frightened animal is dangerous. We let most of them go. You did not spend your effort chasing the wretched. They were already lost, already broken, already gone from whatever they had been before the court took them. Killing them was mercy. But mercy was not always possible in the middle of a cavalry action. One of the wretched ran for the river. He was a small man, dark-skinned, somewhere between 30 and 50. Impossible to be more precise given the state of him. Filthy, half-starved, with the blank, white-ringed eyes of a man who had not slept voluntarily in months. He ran for the river at the north edge of the clearing with a speed that was surprising given his condition, reached the bank without anyone cutting him off, and went in without hesitation. The current was running fast and cold, fed by the snowmelt that still came down from the northern highlands even in July. He went under immediately. We saw him surface once, 30 meters downstream, and then he was gone around the bend in the bank, and I turned Hela back to the dead. I have made note of that moment in 100 retellings of this account to myself in the years since. The wretched who ran for the river, the current that took him, the assumption which I made and which was reasonable and which was wrong, that a malnourished, half-mad slave soldier who went under in a cold, fast river in the 3rd week of July was dead. I have made that note every time because it is the kind of mistake that seems obvious in retrospect and was not obvious in the moment, and if I do not acknowledge it, then I am rewriting history in my own favor, which is the particular vanity of survivors. We dismounted and walked among the dead. The lesions were worse than they had looked from the ridge. Up close, in the flat summer light, they were terrible in a way that was both specific and wrong. Wrong in the way that things warped by the Black Grail were always wrong, in the particular register that distinguished its corruptions from the work of ordinary plague or battlefield wound. The sores were black at the edges, not the gray-black of old blood or the yellow-black of deep infection, but a particular shade that I had seen once before on a missionary of Beelzebub's cult captured outside Tampere in 2009, a color like oil on water with the light going out of it. They wept a yellow fluid that had a sweet smell, nauseatingly sweet, like overripe fruit left in the sun. Where the fluid had dried on the skin, it left a pale, crystalline residue. On one body, a soldier who had been carrying a flag I didn't recognize, some subcult identification I had not encountered. The fingers of the right hand had partially fused. Not the fusing of a scar or a burn, where tissue closes over a gap. This was something being made. Some process of slow amalgamation that had begun to join the first and second fingers at the base. The skin growing between them like a new membrane, pale and translucent, and clearly not yet finished. I stood over that body for a longer moment than the situation strictly required and did not touch the hand, and then went to look at the cage. Paavo had the tarpaulin halfway back already. He stood with his hands at his sides and his rifle unslung and did not look at me when I walked up beside him, which told me he had seen what was inside and was processing it in the particular Finnish way of processing unsettling information, which was to go very still and very quiet and wait for a better framework. I looked at what was inside the cage. She was perhaps 20 years old. She was sitting in the center of the cage with her knees drawn up, her back straight, her hands loose in her lap, and she was looking at Paavo with an expression that was not afraid and not angry and not pleading, and was not, as far as I could tell, any of the things I expected from a woman who had been transported in an iron cage by a heretic column retreating through bog country in July. She was dressed in rags that had once been a dress, dark wool, and despite the rags she carried herself with the kind of stillness that has nothing to do with circumstances. She was beautiful. Not the practical beauty of a woman whose features happened to be arranged well, but something else. Something that did not belong in this light, in this marsh, against these iron bars. Her hair was black and fell loose around her shoulders, and her skin was unblemished in a way that struck me as wrong, and the moment I looked at the dead on the ground around the cart. The tattoos were what fixed my attention. They covered her face from just below her cheekbones down her throat and disappeared beneath the neckline of the rags. And they were not the crude marks of cult identification, the ash smears and rough symbols that the ordinary followers of Beelzebub scratched into their skin with knives and black tallow. These were fine lines, precise and intricate, following the contours of her face with the care of a draftsman who knew his subject intimately. They traced the edges of bone beneath skin, followed the lines of veins and tendons in her throat, coiled in configurations that I did not recognize as any alphabet or ritual script I had encountered. They were old, or appeared old, the ink deep in the skin, not surface marks. She had been carrying these for years, or she had had them put there by someone who was very good at the work. And either way it spoke of intention and permanence, and whatever it was she was not a recent acquisition. Her eyes were black, not dark brown. Black. The iris and the pupil the same depth of color, giving her gaze a quality of absorption rather than reflection. She looked at me the way I had as a child, watched a priest hold up the host. Not reverently, attentively. Hela would not approach the cage. I had led her up by the bridle, and at 10 meters she planted her feet and refused, which she had never done in 6 years, not on a battlefield, not at a burning building, not at the mass graves outside Ulu in 11 that had smelled of something beyond death. I dropped her reins and walked to the cage alone. I stood in front of it for a moment, and the woman looked at me, and I looked at her and said, nothing happened because nothing needed to happen. She was the most important thing I had found in 11 years of patrol. The men gathered. Nobody touched the cage. Paavo said what he had been working toward since I arrived, which was that the marks looked to him like the marks on Black Grail missionaries. He had seen 2 in his time, captured alive both times, briefly, but inverted, reflected. Like whoever had made the symbols had taken the cult's sigils and run them through a mirror. And what came out the other side was this. Mikael, who was 22 and the youngest of the patrol and who operated at a lower frequency of fear than the rest of us, which was either courage or inexperience, and I had never decided which, said she was a prisoner of war. He said we should treat her as a prisoner of war and take her south and let the church's scholars work out what the markings meant. Eriksson said she was a heretic, and we should kill her, and burn the cage, and ride. Kärki said the cage might be trapped. I said we were taking her to Turku. We salvaged wrist irons from the heretic cart. They had a pair there, which told me they had anticipated the need, which told me something about the nature of the transport that I filed away without fully understanding. We opened the cage, which opened easily, the lock turning at a touch as if it had not been locked at all, and she stepped out without resistance and held out her wrists for the irons, and we put them on her, and she gave no sign of feeling them. Mikael helped her onto his horse behind him. She settled into the saddle with an ease that suggested she knew horses. And then she did not move for the rest of the morning, not to look around at the country, not to react to the smell or the insects or the bodies of the dead on the ground around us. We rode south. I set scouts forward and back, and kept the pace high for the first 2 hours until I was satisfied there was no immediate pursuit from the direction of the Hellgate. The bog country in July smells of deep time. Peat is ancient, 10,000 years of compressed organic material, the slow archaeology of everything that has ever died and sunk and been preserved in the cold, acid water. You breathe it in, and it is not unpleasant, not exactly, but it sits in your lungs differently than clean air, heavier, with a richness that is almost the richness of food. The flies rose with the heat of the day, columns of them over the standing water, and the horses moved through the columns with their ears back and their tails working constantly. Above us, in the wide, pale sky, a pair of eagles were riding a thermal far enough south that they showed no interest in us. That was normal. Nothing about the sky or the country looked wrong, which was as much as you could ask for in the northern reaches. She rode with Mikael without touching him. That was the first strange thing. She sat behind him in the saddle with a space between her back and his that should not have been physically sustainable at a canter. There was no reason her balance should have held without contact. And yet it held, perfectly, for hours. He glanced back once, and then looked forward and did not glance back again, which told me he had noticed the same thing, and decided not to think about it. At midday, we stopped at a stream to water the horses. I offered her food, hardtack and dried fish, the standard ration, and she looked at it without expression and did not take it. I offered water. She did not take that either. I watched her carefully for any sign of deterioration from the refusal, any sign that she was thirsty or hungry or suffering in the way a human being would suffer after. I did not know how long she had been in the cage. The heretics had been retreating north for at least a day, probably 2. Before that, whatever they had been doing in the south. She should have been hungry. She should have been thirsty. She looked the same at noon as she had at first light, which was perfectly still and perfectly present, which was not the same as being well, but was not the same as suffering either. At dusk, we stopped to pray. This was not optional. The evening litany of the faithful was not a personal practice for the Hakkapeliittas. It was a unit discipline, as much a part of the operational routine as posting watch and watering horses. We dismounted and formed a rough line, and Paavo led the litany in his flat northern finish, his voice carrying the words with the economy of a man who had said them 10,000 times and did not need to feel them to mean them. The others joined in at the responses. While we prayed, we strung the icon clusters on the horses' bridles, the small copper-backed images of the saints that were our primary protection against the corruption of the Hellgate country. The horses settled immediately when the icons were in place, the way they always did, the animal anxiety dropping out of them like a weight removed. All except Hela, and all except Mikael's horse, Tuomi, who had the woman on his back. Hela stood at the edge of the picket line and would not settle. Her ears were flat, and she was showing the whites of her eyes, and her nostrils were working in the particular way they worked when she smelled something I could not smell. I went to her and spoke quietly and put my hand on her neck and felt the tension in the muscles there, a vibration that was not shivering because the evening was warm. And she put her head against my chest for a moment, and then pulled back and went back to watching the woman. Tuomi was worse. He had been a steady horse. Mikael had trained him himself over 2 years. And he was standing with all 4 feet splayed and his head low in the submissive posture horses used when confronted with a predator too large to fight. Not fear. Terror, in the technical sense. The kind that shuts down every system except the ones needed to survive the next 10 seconds. The woman sat on his back, and he stood there and bore it, and I thought, watching him, that this took more courage than anything I had asked of Hela in 6 years. She watched us pray. I noticed her watching, and I noticed what I thought I saw in her expression. Not curiosity, not contempt. Something between those things, or beyond them, a quality of attention that was evaluative without being emotional. She watched the way a scholar watches a ceremony he already understands, but is gathering data about. I found it more disturbing than hostility would have been. Hostility, I knew how to read. We made a cold camp after dark in a birch stand 200 meters off the road. No fire. The horses on a picket line with the icons doubled. The woman chained by the wrist irons to a length of chain wrapped around a birch trunk, which I felt foolish doing even as I did it. There was nothing about her that suggested she would run, and somehow that absence of the expected resistance made the precautions feel more necessary, not less. She sat with her back against the birch and did not sleep. I could see her eyes in the low light, open, watching the dark between the trees. I took the first watch myself. I sat across the camp from her, perhaps 6 meters, my carbine across my knees, and watched the tree line in my sector. She watched me. I am not given to discomfort from being watched. You could not do this work if a look unnerved you, but this was different. It was sustained and unblinking in a way that had nothing to do with hostility or challenge. After 20 minutes, I looked directly back at her, and she held the eye contact without any change in expression. We stayed like that for a long time. Later, writing this account, I said I should have looked away. I have thought about this a great deal. I think she was doing something in that exchange, reading something in me, not my thoughts. I do not believe it was as simple as that, but something else, some deeper register. The way a horse reads a rider not through what the rider says, but through the quality of their weight and tension. I think she found what she was looking for. I think that encounter in the cold camp on the first night is the reason for what happened later. I think that is when it began. But I did not know that then. I went to sleep at the end of my watch, satisfied that we had lost any pursuit, and did not wake until Risto shook my shoulder at dawn. The first hour was discipline, nothing more. Move south, keep the column tight, keep the cage cart between the outriders, keep looking back. The mist had come down over the bog and was burning off slowly in the morning cold, and the path we followed, it could not properly be called a road. It was a 2-rut track through frozen sedge grass, the surface cracked by the last hard frost into something that held the cart's weight grudgingly, required attention that was useful, because it left less room for the other kind of thinking. There were 12 of us. I took a moment on the move to account for them one by one. Risto on the right flank, the best tracker in the patrol and the quietest man I had served with, who communicated at rest through a small vocabulary of looks and nods, and whose opinions, when he offered them, arrived already considered and worth waiting for. Eriksson on the left, large, phlegmatic, the kind of physical competence that came from having been large all his life and learning to move it correctly, a man who never hurried and was rarely late. Kerki on rear guard, methodical and slightly obsessive about kit, who had not in 3 years of patrol lost a piece of equipment or left a campsite without walking every meter of it to check. These were the men I would bet on. I had bet on them before. Mikkel was the youngest by 8 years. He rode with the looseness of someone still unlearning what civilians thought riding meant, still working against the horse in small ways, still using his back when his hips should carry it. He asked questions I had stopped asking a decade ago, and I found them interesting for that reason. The way the same stretch of country looks different from a height you have not occupied before. Johannes and Paavo rode beside the cart. Johannes had done his first patrol in the Northern Circuit in the year of the Corpse War's Northern Surge, had ridden through burning Oulu with a pistol in each hand, and the accumulation of that history had not made him hard so much as dense, the way iron differs from wood, not because it resists, but because there is more of it per volume. Paavo was Northern Finnish in the way a stone wall is Finnish, constructed of available material, built for function, not elegance, resistant to weather in a way that was not stubbornness, but constitution. He spoke rarely and took his time with words the way a craftsman takes time with joints. He was from the lake country near Tampere, and he had the flat vowels and flat affect of that region, which meant you could not read his internal state from his face, and had to learn the smaller indicators, the pace of his breathing, the set of his shoulders, whether his rifle sat across his thighs or rested against the saddle horn. He was the most reliable man I have ever commanded. I say this plainly because he is dead. And reliability is not a quality remembered the way heroism is. And it should be. The remaining 6 I knew less well or less long. Erkki had 12 years of Hakkapeliitta service and wore it the way some men wore old gear, without comment, without exhibition, the experience simply part of the load. He had the careful eye of a man who has survived by noticing small things and the good sense not to share everything he noticed with his officers. Johannes was grey-bearded and deliberate, one of the older men in the rotation, known for keeping his post without exception and for a dry economy with words that the younger men sometimes read as hostility and was simply precision. Laurie I knew primarily as a capable rider who could dress a wound without being asked, and who had, on a previous patrol, kept his head during a gas contact when younger men had not. Sami was the youngest after Mikael, 17, possibly 18, in the way of recruits who had perhaps misrepresented their age, and had a quality of alertness that would eventually become judgment if he lived long enough for the translation. The empty cage sat on the 2-wheeled cart that the heretics had used to carry it. The cart was roughly made. Heretic equipment frequently was, as if the craftwork of mortal utility sat beneath the dignity of what it served, but it rolled well enough on the frozen track. The cage itself was iron. The bars finger-thick and close-spaced, welded at the intersections rather than slotted, with the deep orange-red patina of long oxidation over raw black iron. I had examined it at the marsh, while the men secured the area, looking for maker's marks or the sigils that heretic artificers use to indicate purpose. I found nothing legible. The welds were unusually clean. Whoever had built this cage had been a better metal worker than the cart suggested. Inside, fixed between 2 bars, was the plank she had been sitting on when we found her. It was worn smooth in the center, polished to a finish that spoke of long occupation. I chose not to think too closely about what that implied. The icons on the cage rattled softly as the cart moved. The sound was irregular. Not wind, not the motion of travel, but something that produced short chains of rattle without visible cause. I heard it at the second hour and attended to it for some time and concluded that the rattles occurred at intervals that were neither regular nor random. There was something in the timing I could not reduce to pattern or dismiss as noise. I told myself it was harmonics from the track's surface. I did not wholly believe this. Risto fell back to my position at the 3rd hour and told me without preamble what he had seen. The bog to the east was showing old cart tracks, wide-gauge heretic supply work, heading north, 3 days old. More than 1 cart, more than a dozen men on foot. At the point where the tracks met the road, a single man had stopped and waited, standing, facing south. Long enough that his feet had sunk 2 centimeters into the marsh mud before the cold refroze around them. I asked how he could read the direction from the print. He said the body weight was forward. When you stand and watch something, your weight comes forward onto the balls of your feet, slightly, without choosing to. You could read it in deep mud if you knew what to look for. I told him to resume his position and watch the eastern bog until the light went. We made 40 kilometers on the first day, which was strong work with a cart and horses on their 6th operational day, without proper rest. I was satisfied with the pace, professionally satisfied. The clean note of a plan executing well, nothing more. We camped in a birch stand 200 meters off the road, and I set the watches and posted myself for the first one. And I have described what happened at that first camp. The eye contact, in the dark, the thing she was doing or reading in that exchange. I have described it, but I do not know that I have conveyed the particular quality of her attention, which was not threatening, and was not gentle, and was not the blankness of the catatonic. It was the attention of something estimating, measuring, taking account. The second day was harder riding. The open bog gave way as we moved south to old pine forest, the trees tall and dark and close-packed, the canopy 100 feet up shutting out the sky and making the world into a corridor of trunks and shadow and the deep carpet of needles that deadened sound. The horses' hooves went quiet beneath us. The cartwheels went quiet. Even the icons quieted, the rattle absorbed by the packed earth and the thick air beneath the canopy. It should have been a relief. That quiet. It was not a relief. The birds were wrong. In the bog country there had been birds everywhere. Waders at the water margins, finches and warblers in the scrub, harriers quartering the hummocks. In the forest there was nothing. We rode through a corridor of silence with the particular quality of recent vacancy, as if the birds had left not because this was empty country, but because something had come through and they had not yet come back. I noted it and said nothing. The men noted it and said nothing. We held the pace. At noon, Risto came back from his outrider position at a canter, which he did only when something needed saying immediately. He swung in beside me and gave his report without preamble. He had cut east on the high pine ground to check our flanks and come across riders, 3 of them, dark cavalry, heretic by their kit and by the distance they held, pacing us at perhaps 600 meters, working the tree line. He had watched them for 5 minutes before pulling back. They knew the terrain. They were not closing, they were reporting. That was bad enough, but it was not the worst of what Risto had seen. One of the mounts had something tied to the saddle forward of the pommel. Risto had used his field glass. A head. Human. Male. The skin at the neck cut cleanly, the kind of precision that came from knowing where to put the blade. The face he could not read at range, but the build of what remained was consistent with someone malnourished and small, and the ragged cloth still attached to what was left of the neck was the same rough, undyed homespun the wretched had been wearing when the column came through the valley. He had gone into the river. They had pulled him out. Somewhere between the ambush site and noon of the following day, they had found him, run him to ground, taken what they needed from him, and killed him cleanly. Which spoke to something. He had had information worth extracting, and they had known to look for it. The men were quiet after that. I moved the outriders in closer, compressing our security interval, and increased the pace. The heretics had 3 scouts in the field at minimum, probably more that Risto had not seen, and they knew our line of march, our numbers, and how long we had been moving. I thought about what that meant and arrived at no comfortable conclusion. That second evening I took the patrol a kilometer off the road and held position for 2 hours in the deepening dark, the horses tied and the men in the pine needles watching the road through gaps in the trees. Nothing came. The road was empty and the forest was empty, and when full dark arrived we made a cold camp, the chain around the birch trunk, the double icons, triple watch, short intervals. The horses smelled the forest that night in a way they had not the first night. Not the simple alertness of animals on picket in strange country, but the particular ear orientation and nostril flare of horses that had identified something specific and were waiting to identify it more precisely. Hala stood with her head up and her ears forward for 20 minutes without changing position, which was not a thing she did normally, not a thing horses did. And when I went to her, she let me put my hand on her neck and she was dry and cool, and I could feel the tension in her body the way you feel tension in a cable. Not vibration, not movement, just the held tautness of something under load. I doubled the watch interval. I slept 4 hours. I woke with the sound of Hala moving on the picket line and lay still for 30 seconds listening to the forest until it resolved back into ordinary night forest. And then I slept again. On the third day, Paavo got sick. It started at first light. I saw him vomit quietly at the edge of the camp and assumed a bad stomach, the kind of thing that happened on extended patrol when the rations were poor and the water was suspect. By mid-morning he was burning with fever, shaking in the saddle despite the warmth of the day, and by noon he was muttering. At first I thought he was praying. The Hakkapeliittas sometimes prayed under their breath on the march, an old habit. But the sounds were not Finnish and not Swedish, and not the church Latin of the standard litany. They were something else, without clear phonemes, without the rhythmic structure of either prayer or speech. They had the quality of a sound that was not quite language, trying to become language. By midday, 2 more men were showing fever. Johannes, who was 40 and had been riding since before I was born, and who I would have bet a year's ducats against going down to anything short of a direct artillery round, and young Sammy, who was 19 and who had the particular constitution of someone who had grown up hard, lean, and resistant, and practically indifferent to cold or wet or short rations. I checked their hands and their necks and their faces. No lesions, not yet. But the fever was high and climbing, and the hallucinations were beginning. Johannes was looking at his horse's ears and speaking to someone who was not there, gently and clearly, the way you spoke to someone you were trying to calm. I thought about killing the woman. She was what they were hunting. Remove her from the equation and we might yet make a clean getaway. The men might recover. I did not do it. I do not have a satisfying explanation for this decision. The Church's law on prisoners of war was clear, and the Church's law on suspected heretics was different, but also clear, and she fit neither category cleanly, and I think the incompleteness of the categorization was part of what stopped me. That, and the way she was sitting on Tuomi's back with her wrists in irons and her back straight, not pleading, not trying to negotiate, not doing any of the things that would have made the decision easier because they would have made her more legible. She was not legible. I could not put a name to what she was, and you could not properly kill something you could not name. This is not a rational position. I know it is not rational. I held it anyway. I had Paavo and Johannes and Sami strapped to their saddles. We rode slower after that. That evening we made a proper camp. We had no choice. 3 men who could not sit a horse unassisted were a tactical liability in cold camp conditions, and I needed fire for the wounded, to keep their temperature manageable and to boil the water that I was pouring into them at intervals with mixed results. We were 6 fit soldiers and 2 who were semi-functional and 3 who were useless, and I set a double watch and felt the mathematics of the situation doing what mathematics does in situations like this, which is to arrange itself into an expression that does not resolve well. I had a fire built at the center of the camp and the horses picketed in a ring with every icon we had between us on their bridles. The woman was chained to the iron tent pin at the heart of the camp, 10 meters from the fire. I had used the iron pin because the birch trunks had begun to seem insufficient, not because I thought the chains would hold her if she decided not to be held, but because the iron seemed like the right material for what she was. I sat across the fire from her in the late evening, the sick men quiet in their tents, the watch in their positions, and the fire burning steadily between us. I looked at her. She looked at me. After a time I said, in Finnish, that she was under the protection of the faithful now. I said that whatever she was, whatever the heretics had been carrying her toward, that was over. I said she would be treated with whatever dignity a prisoner of war was owed, that no one in this patrol would harm her, that in Turku she would be handled by people who were trained to handle whatever she was, and that I understood she probably did not trust this, and that I did not expect her to trust it, but that it was true. She said nothing. Kärki cleaned his carbine that evening. He did this every evening, which was discipline. But that night, he cleaned it a second time after the watch change, which was anxiety expressed through the nearest available competence. I watched him do it from across the camp and said nothing. There were things you did not name directly when they were already being managed. The sick men had settled into their tents by dark. Paavo's murmuring had gone quiet in the middle of the previous hour, which was not improvement. Quiet in the late stage of a black grail fever was not silence as recovery, but silence as absorption. The body's resources redirected inward. I checked his breathing twice, and it was even, which was something, and his skin had the waxy translucency that was the deep fever's mark, the body's blood retreating to the core. Hans had asked for the water at dusk. I had given it to him, and he had drunk and looked at me with complete lucidity and said, in the careful Swedish he used when he wanted to be precise, "You should have left the cage." I told him I had not had that option at the time. He said he knew. He said it the way you said a thing you had accepted as fact and not as recrimination, and then his eyes went somewhere else and he did not speak again that evening. Sammy was the worst. He was young enough that the fever burned him fast, the way a hot fire moves through dry wood faster than through wet. By the end of the watch, he was past speech and past coherent hallucination. He lay in his tent and breathed, and occasionally his hands moved, slow, crawling movements of the fingers that had nothing to do with reaching and everything to do with something my thinking kept moving away from and I kept bringing back. I set a triple watch, 3 men at different compass points, staggered intervals, 5-minute checks between posts. I had Erkki on the north post, 12 years, a Hakkapeliitta, steady and capable of the kind of patient vigilance that shorter tenure men found difficult. Johannes on the south, the older of the 2 watchmen, grey-bearded and deliberate in all things, the kind of man whose thoroughness meant you rarely had to check his work. Laurie on the west, the youngest of the full-strength men, quick-reflexed and slightly too aggressive in his assessment of what constituted a threat, which in most situations was a liability, and in this one was probably the right profile. I slept. The sound that woke me was the horses. Not the specific alarm call, but the pitch below it, the gear above unease and below full panic, the sound that lives in the chest rather than the ears, the particular quality of equine distress that experienced cavalry learned to wake for the way a mother learns to wake for the specific pitch of her child's cry as opposed to all other night sounds. I was out of my bedroll with my carbine before I was fully conscious of being awake. The north post was empty. Erki's carbine was on the ground. The pine needles around the post showed the impressions of his boots at the standing position and nothing else. No scuff of a struggle, no pooled blood, no fallen equipment except the carbine itself. He had been there, and then he had not been there, and the transition between those states had left no evidence I could read in the firelight. I found Johannes 20 meters from the south post. He was on his back with his hands at his sides, which was not the position of a man who had fallen, but of a man who had been placed, and his throat had been opened in a single, precise horizontal line, clean enough that the blood had sheeted down rather than sprayed, pooling beneath him without marking the surrounding needles. Not the work of urgency, technical, planned, the same precision I had seen in Risto's description of the head on the saddle, the same understanding of anatomy, the same commitment to a clean result. These were not opportunistic raiders. They had come here for something specific, and they knew how to operate in the dark. I signaled the camp alert in the standard manner. 3 short, low whistles, which woke the men quietly rather than loudly. And the difference between those two states in a camp that might be under observation was the difference between alerting your own people and alerting whoever was watching. I had Mikael, Kärki, Eriksson, Risto, and the 2 semi-functional men on their feet within 90 seconds. Lauri came in from the west post at a run. I held up 2 fingers and pointed north and south, and he read it correctly and moved to cover the gap. The horses were pulling the picket line taut. All of them. The icons on their bridles were rattling with the force of it, not the soft, irregular sound I had noted on the road, but a hard, metallic percussion. The icons striking the bridle hardware at the frequency of full equine alarm. Hela was in the middle of the line, and she was screaming, not the single note of startled horses, the full lung scream of a horse that had identified something her biology had no category for and was expressing the absence of that category at maximum volume. I had 6 fit men, 2 walking wounded, 2 who could not move without assistance. I arranged the fit men in a circle around the camp with their backs to the fire and their faces to the dark, which was opposite to instinct. Instinct said, put your back to the unknown and your face to the light. But that was the instinct that killed you because the light ruined your night vision and made you a target. I told them, anything that moves at the tree line, call it first. The attack came 30 seconds later. They came out of the north tree line first and then from the east, which told me the north was the feint, a point of contact attack to draw our attention and compress our formation while the main weight came from a different angle. This was tactical thinking. The wretched did not do tactical thinking. These were not all wretched. There were more of them than I had anticipated. 40 at minimum, more likely 50, difficult to count in the chaos of the first 30 seconds, and they were organized in a way the column at Sarpola Marsh had not been organized. The column had been the sick and the stumbling, men carrying something they barely understood. This was a recovery force. These were soldiers, fresh Grail thralls, recently enough corrupted that they still had the manic energy of the newly infected, rather than the end-stage heaviness of those already half-consumed. They moved fast, they moved in groups, and they had tried to take the watch before they announced themselves, which was tactical thinking correctly applied. They came through the fire, literally through it, scattering burning branches, their boots on the coals and not slowing, and we met them in the light of our own disrupted camp. I shot 2 in the first 4 seconds, one at 20 meters, one at 12, both chest shots, and the first dropped, and the second stumbled, and came on. I put a second round into the second man, and he stumbled again and reached me before I had the bolt worked for the third shot. The third shot was at 6 inches, upward through the jaw, angled for the brainstem, and that stopped him. He was a large man, and he fell against me, and I had to put my boot on his chest to lever him off, which took a second I did not have. Paavo came out of his tent with his rifle. He was in fever. You could see it in the flush of his face and the looseness of his coordination, the slight delay between intention and action that fever imposed on fine motor control. He could not hold a sustained aim. He put his rifle to his shoulder, and it wavered, and he lowered it and reversed it, gripping it at the muzzle end, and waded into the nearest group of thralls with the buttstock. The first blow dropped a man, the second blow broke the arm of another, and the third blow connected with something I could not see clearly, and produced a sound I did not expect. He was shouting in Finnish, not the murmuring without phonemes, but clear Finnish. The sharp, imperative syllables of a man who had found his way back through the fever to something functional, something that could be commanded. He was making room. He was buying the men behind him space to work, and he knew it. And the fever was burning him through it. Kerki found his pattern within the first 20 seconds and held it. He moved counterclockwise around the inner perimeter of the camp, shooting and working the bolt and stepping 1 position right, shooting and working the bolt and stepping 1 position right, a methodical circuit that kept his sight lines clear and his back away from the darkness. He had replaced the panic of the first contact with the kind of machine efficiency that was his natural state under pressure, and in the chaos around him he was a fixed point of directed, accurate violence. I counted 4 of his shots in the first minute, and I'm confident each one hit. Mikael was in the thick of it almost immediately. He had no carbine at hand and came out of his tent with his belt knife and a wood axe we used for camp fuel, the short-handled kind, and he was in the press before anyone could direct him. He was fast, genuinely fast. Fast in the way that the very young sometimes are before they learn caution, and he used the axe in the tight space with none of the restraint that experience imposes. He caught a thrall across the face with the flat of it and followed with the knife and moved on before the man was down. He was bleeding from a cut on his left forearm by the second minute and either had not noticed or had decided not to. The Grail thralls with the heavy lesions, the ones who had been carrying the Black Grail for months, whose skin had the textured granulation of advanced transformation, were the hardest. 3 rounds to stop, sometimes 4. They absorbed the hits with the disconnection from physical consequence that went beyond ordinary pain tolerance. One of them caught Eriksson around the throat with both hands, full grip, body weight behind it. And Eriksson was a large man, and he broke the grip by sheer muscle and drove his knife into the man's sternum, and the man continued pressing forward until Kerki shot him twice in the back, and even then he went down slowly, settling rather than falling, the way a heavy structure settles when its support is removed. Risto was behind me. I heard him rather than saw him, the precise, unhurried shots of a man with natural accuracy who had learned not to waste it. He was managing our south and east arc, calling out position changes between shots, which was the kind of professional calm that you could not train into a man if it was not already there. He called out, "Left flank, 3, flanking." I pivoted left and found them, and we took them in sequence. A wretched came through the fire with his clothes burning, and his face expressionless, and his arms already reaching. He was in the end stage of transformation. The granulation had covered most of his visible skin, and his fingers had begun the elongation I would see more fully later that night. And the fire was not a thing he registered as pain or threat. He simply came through it the way water comes through an opening, by filling whatever space was available. I could not get a clear shot. Eriksson stepped in front of me and hit the wretched with his shoulder, a full-weight collision, and the wretched went sideways, and Kerki shot him twice from 6 feet, and he went down, and the flames on his coat continued burning. We were holding, but barely. The numbers were against us, and the space was wrong. A camp perimeter designed for defensive rest, not for receiving a coordinated assault at close quarters. I was aware of men going down. Laurie, who had been reliable on the West Ark, was no longer calling his positions, and the West Ark had gone quiet in the way things go quiet when the man covering them is no longer covering them. I did not have time to address this directly. I filed it. Then the sound came. It was low, it was not a voice, and it was not a weapon. It came from the far side of the camp, from the direction of the tree line I was not watching, and it entered the chest rather than the ears. A resonance, like the sound a cathedral bell makes, felt through the flagstone floor. I felt it in my sternum. I felt it in my teeth. Beside me, the Grail thrall I was struggling with went momentarily rigid, as if the sound had hit a switch, and then he turned his head. He turned it in a way that did not track from me to the source. He turned it directly to the source without searching, the way a compass needle swings north. I pushed him off me and looked. She was standing in a clearing at the margin of the camp, at the place where the firelight reached the tree line and ended. The moonlight was clear and full, and it fell on her directly, and she stood in it without shadow, which I note because shadows were falling in every other direction from the fire, and hers was not among them. She had taken off the rags we had given her. She was standing perfectly still. The tattoos on her face and throat were glowing. I do not use that word carelessly. They were luminescent, a blue-black bioluminescence, each symbol pulsing with slow regularity, the pulse not quite matching any rhythm I could identify, not the human heartbeat, not a breath cycle, something slower and more fundamental. The symbols were the same symbols I had seen in the cage, the fine dark lines tracing her features, and in the moonlight they were alive in a way they had not been in daylight. She was beautiful, and she was terrible, and nobody moved. The sound was coming from her, not from her mouth, from the symbols. Then her fingers moved, not the ordinary movement of fingers, not reaching, not curling. They elongated. The skin at the knuckles tightened and whitened and then split, not the way skin splits when it is torn, but the way a chrysalis splits, along a seam that was always there. And what was beneath the split skin was not flesh, the color of flesh, but something darker, something that absorbed the moonlight rather than reflecting it. The elongation was slow, 6 centimeters, 7. The tips of the fingers became points, not bone, but something denser than bone. The symbols began to move. They moved from her face and throat downward, spreading across her shoulders, her chest, her arms, not like tattoos applied to skin, but like something writing itself from inside. The symbols emerging into visibility, as if they had always been there, just below the surface. And only now were they close enough to the surface to be seen. They covered her arms to the wrists, covered her hands, moved down across her torso, and disappeared below the margin of what the moonlight showed. Her spine shifted. Not with violence, with precision, each vertebra resettling into a new configuration with a sound that I heard only because everything else had gone silent, a sound like ice adjusting to new weight. Her posture changed. She was taller. Not physically taller, I did not change. But taller in the way something is tall when it begins to occupy more of the space around it than its physical dimensions account for. She was still. For a long moment she was still. The transformation arrested, and she looked at me across the clearing. I do not know what she communicated. I have spent 11 years trying to reconstruct it. Her face was still a face then, the same face I had seen in the cage and in the camp at night, and watching us pray at dusk. The eyes were the same black eyes that had watched me across the fire. Whatever was changing in her had not yet reached her face, and for that last moment of her face's existence, she used it to look at me, and I looked back, and there was something in the exchange, not a message, not a warning, something more fundamental than that. The way the eyes of the very old sometimes communicate a kind of accumulated weight that has moved beyond language. Then her face changed. It began at the tattooed lines, the fine dark marks that followed the contours of her cheekbones and jaw, and it split along those lines with a slowness that was worse than violence would have been. The skin opened precisely along each mark, not tearing, parting, and what was beneath was not blood and bone and the ordinary architecture of a human face. It was something that moved, something that had been contained within the human form the way a sound is contained within a room, and now the walls were opening. I do not describe it further. I cannot describe it further with accuracy. What I have is impressions, depth where there should not be depth, a sense of multiple things moving in coordination that was not the coordination of a body but of something larger that used a body as a provisional address. The sound increased. The pulse of the cymbals accelerated, matching something that was not a heartbeat because it was too large for a heartbeat. The heretics broke. The healthy ones, the soldiers who had been infected recently enough that they still had fear, broke and ran back for the tree line, scattering in all directions, dropping weapons. A heretic sergeant who had been fighting Mikael 5 seconds before simply turned and ran into the dark and did not look back. The infected did not run. The Grail thralls with the lesions, the ones who had been carrying the Black Grail long enough that it had begun the process of assimilation, they stopped fighting. They stopped moving. They turned, all of them, toward the thing in the clearing, and they began to walk toward it, slowly, with their arms at their sides and then lifting, rising outward from their bodies, the way a man opens his arms to receive someone he has been waiting for. I ran. I hit the tree line at the south edge of the camp and went in without slowing. The dark closed around me and I ran by feel and by hearing, my carbine in my right hand, the compass in my left, though I could not read it in the dark. I ran south. The sound from the clearing was behind me and above me and in my chest, but I could hear it diminishing as I put distance between myself and the camp. I ran hard for a minute, 2 minutes, heard nothing pursuing, heard the sound continuing to pulse behind me, and then the trees began to thin and there was light ahead. I came out into a clearing in the moonlight. I gave myself 20 seconds to orient before I moved. This is the Hakkapeliitta discipline for any contact break. 20 seconds of stillness to let your hearing recalibrate before you commit to a direction, because the first impulse after contact is to run, and the first direction you run is frequently wrong. 20 seconds with my back to the nearest large trunk, the carbine up, the compass in my left hand. The sound from the clearing was behind me. A specific direction. Behind me, and above me. as if the sound had a vertical axis that was not the horizon but something higher, something centered above the clearing like a column of pressure. The trees around me were making their own sound, the faint creak of cold trunks in the night wind. But there was no wind. The creaking was coming from the trunks themselves, a settling sound, the sound of something adjusted, as if the ground was doing something to the root systems. I ran south, true south by the compass, my left arm held straight, reading the luminous dial by feel and the habit of 1,000 night marches. I ran hard, placing my feet in the way you placed them in forest night running, flat, no heel strike, the weight accepting and redistributing, 400 meters at pace, and then the trees thinned. The clearing opened in front of me. I stopped at the tree line because stopping was the only response my training had not preempted. My training had responses for ambush, for artillery, for gas, for the particular chaos of a camp assault. My training had no response for running 400 meters through deep old forest and arriving at the place I had started from. The clearing was perhaps 40 meters across. The thing was at its center, smaller than it would become, less defined, still in the process of establishing its dimensions. It had the quality of something testing the available space, pressing outward against the constraints of physical volume, the way a heated gas presses against its container. The 3 Grail thralls, who had walked toward it with their arms outstretched, were no longer individually distinct. They had been incorporated at the margins, their physical matter no longer separate from what they had walked into. I stood at the tree line for a count of 5 seconds. The sound moved through my sternum with its slow pulse. I looked at the edge of the clearing, the specific edge, the grass and needle margin where the forest floor met the open ground, and I marked it in my mind. The particular angle of a fallen birch trunk at the northwest edge, the way the canopy opened in a rough oval above, the specific character of the moonlight in this space. I marked it the way you marked a map reference, precisely, for confirmation. Then I turned around and went back into the trees, and ran harder. South, on the compass. Harder than the first run. I was breathing correctly now, the body warm, the stride extended. I counted my steps. At the pace I was running, 200 steps was approximately 200 meters. And I counted 200 steps, and then 200 more, and then another 200. And at 600 steps, the ground changed beneath my feet from the needle mat of old forest to the crumbled earth of a logged area, secondary birch growth, the trees younger and thinner, the ground with the churned quality of clear-cut land growing back. This was different country. This was not the clearing. I came through the birch scrub at a run, and the ground opened up, and I saw the moonlight, and went through the last stand of young birches, and came out and stopped. The fallen birch trunk was at the northwest edge at the same angle. The canopy opened in the same rough oval. The moonlight fell in the same specific quality on the same space. The thing at the center was larger. Not much. Perhaps a third again, but measurably larger, more defined in outline, its surface motion more complex and purposeful. The thralls, who had been incorporated at the margins, were now fully absorbed. The infected heretics who remained, 4 of them, new figures I had not seen on the first view, were at the edge of the clearing, not walking toward it, standing, looking at it the way you looked at something you had been waiting for. I stood at the tree line. I had been a soldier for 11 years. In those 11 years, I had developed a practical relationship with fear. I knew its textures, knew when it was useful information about a real threat, and when it was noise from the biological system that had not been updated for the present situation. What I was feeling now was not fear in the ordinary sense. It was the specific sensation of a category of experience that my 11 years had not prepared me for. The sensation of the geography refusing to cooperate. The clearing was not in the forest the way a clearing was normally in a forest, occupying a fixed position in relation to the trees around it. The clearing existed at a fixed point, and the forest was arranged around it, and every direction I ran brought me back to the same margin, because the margin was the only edge the clearing had. The geometry had broken at some point between the camp and the first run. I could not say when. I did not know the mechanism. And the broken geometry meant that my compass and my training and my knowledge of this country were all operating in a space that was no longer working by the rules they had been designed for. I thought about this carefully. The icons. The icons on the cage had rattled without cause. The icons on Gila's bridle had been cold and solid under my fingers when I had prayed over the horses at dusk. I had the icons from my own kit. I wore 2 at the throat, the standard patrol issue, copper on a cord, blessed by the garrison priest at Turku before each circuit. I put my hand to my throat and found them and held them and said the first word of the evening litany. The sound from the clearing pushed back, not against the words, against the place in my brain where the words lived. A slow, heavy pressure like a thumb on a bruise, not painful but displacing, moving the words sideways away from the retrieval point. I could feel where the words should be. I could feel the litany's shape, the rhythm I had said 10,000 times, the specific cadence my grandmother had taught me sitting on a chair too big for me in a kitchen on the Kokomaki River. The shape was there. The words were not. I stood at the margin of the clearing and breathed and thought about the kitchen. Small, low ceiling. The smell of pine resin and black bread and something cooking on the range, something with onions. The late autumn smell of a farmhouse preparing for winter. My grandmother's hands were large, the hands of a woman who had worked outside all her life, and they were folded in her lap as she said the litany slowly so I could follow. She did not look at a book. She said it from memory, the way the faithful of the lake country had always said it, passed from mouth to ear across generations because the written word could be taken from you. But what you held in your memory was yours, alone. I reached for the memory the way you reached for a handhold in the dark, by knowing it was there, by trusting the knowledge even when you could not find the surface. The sound pressed. I pressed back. Blessed are they who keep the faith when faith finds no foothold. The second line came first. It always had. Something in the rhythm of the second line made it more accessible than the first, and the first line followed it the way it always had, the first line being the announcement and the second being the meaning. In the sight of the Eternal, who sees what is and what shall be and what endures between them, we name ourselves faithful. I said it aloud. My voice sounded wrong in the clearing, flat, compressed, as if the air was accepting the sound but not carrying it, absorbing each word at source. I kept saying it. I turned back into the trees while saying it. The third run was different. The trees were not different. The compass bearing was the same true south I had run twice before. But there was a quality to the forest now that had not been there before, a density to the air, a slight resistance, as if the space between the trunks was thicker than air had a right to be. Not impediment, texture. I ran through it saying the litany and felt the words finding their full shape as I ran, each line recovering its rhythm, the familiar progress of the prayer becoming the more familiar than anything else about the night. The sound was still in my chest. I said the litany over it the way you spoke over a noise that could not be stopped. Not drowning it, not fighting it, just continuing to speak so that the noise did not become the only sound. At the 400-step count, I heard Hela, not in front of me, to the left, the full lung scream of a horse, past, controlling. And then a lower sound beneath it. Hela's specific terror sound. The sound I had heard on nights when the northern wind brought the smell of the hellgate across the bog, and she picked it up and went rigid with it. I turned left from the compass line and moved toward the sound, and the birch trunks thinned, and I saw her at the margin of the tree line, legs braced and head down, the icons on her bridle at full rattle. I walked toward her saying the litany. She did not run. This was not because she was calm. She was not calm. She was beyond calm into the state past it, the state where the animal brain has processed the available options and found none and is simply holding. But she did not run from me. I reached her bridle and put my hand on the metal of the icons, and they were cold, genuinely cold. The cold of iron in night air, the material cold of things made by human hands from the earth, without the warmth of living tissue. And the cold was real and specific and mine, and I held it. Something gave, the way a knot gives when it has been worked against long enough, not the clean release of a cut, but the slow yielding of something under sustained load, each strand parting in sequence until the last one goes. I felt it in my sternum first, the pulse from the clearing faltering losing its frequency, the slow resonance dropping a register and then another. The geometry of the forest changed. I could not see it change. I felt it change. The way air pressure changes in a room when a door is opened, when what was closed becomes connected to something larger. The density went out of the air between the trunks. The trees were simply trees again. I mounted Hela in one motion and rode south, and the south continued to be south for as long as I asked it to be. I came up a low rise through increasingly open ground, the old forest giving way to the secondary growth of a logged area, young birches tight-packed and the ground clearer underfoot. And at the crest of the rise, I stopped. Not because I decided to stop, because Hela stopped, and because I looked back. Through the young birches and the gaps in the pine canopy, 3/4 of a kilometer away, the clearing was visible in the moonlight. What was in it had no resemblance to the woman. It had no resemblance to anything I could name with confidence because it had no fixed form. It was mass and motion, a body in the process of defining what a body of this kind would be, testing its new dimensions against the constraints of the physical world with the methodical confidence of something that had never had reason to expect the world would refuse it. It was the size of a farmhouse, approximately. It was still moving, slowly, a continuous interior motion that expressed itself on the surface as rippling and realignment, and the steady absorption of what remained on the ground around it. Bodies, or what had been bodies, drawn in at the margins in the unhurried way that a tide drawn across sand draws small things with it. It was still growing. I understood it then, watching it from the rise with the adrenaline of the clearing beginning to resolve into something colder and more durable. I understood what I had been carrying in my cage for 3 days. Not a prisoner, not a trophy, not a captive. The cage had not been keeping her contained. The cage had been keeping other things out, keeping her intact, keeping the process she contained from being interrupted by anything that might slow or divert or damage it. The heretics had not been transporting a person northward. They had been shepherding a becoming, a process of transformation that had been underway for, I did not know how long, months, Years, perhaps. Something that had been seeded in a human vessel and was completing its gestation, and needed only to be brought to the Hellgate country where the concentration of infernal energy in the earth and air and water would feed the last stage of its growth. She had not been their prisoner. She had been their cargo. And she had been ready, or close enough to ready that the cage's protection had failed, or was no longer needed. The woman, the form the woman had been, was not visible anywhere in what occupied the clearing. This was not absence in the way a body's absence is absence, recoverable to the imagination as a form that had merely gone elsewhere. She was not absent. She was incorporated. Whatever had worn that straight-backed stillness, those bare feet flat on the cage floor, those eyes that had looked directly at me across the fire, that had been a vessel, nothing more, a shape maintained with the patience of something that knew the shape would eventually no longer be required. The patience had been the cruelty of it. 3 days of carrying it, 3 days of Mikael offering her water, 3 days of the icon rattle and the march south, and all of it had been the container being careful with itself until it arrived where it needed to arrive. I watched the amalgam for 60 seconds. I counted them, each second in my head, the way I had been trained to count intervals, the size and the motion and the steady absorption of the last of the infected dead. Then I turned hella south and rode without stopping until Turku. I arrived at dawn of the second day after the clearing, on a horse that had covered a distance that should have taken 3 days in 2, and that was either the quality of the animal or something else, something that I prefer not to examine closely, the possibility that the geography had been different on the way south than it should have been, more direct, less complex. I had Mikael with me, half-conscious in the saddle, and one other man, Laurie, who had a shrapnel wound in his left shoulder that I had bandaged on the move, and that needed attention he was not going to get until Turku. That was 3 survivors, including myself. The patrol had been 12. I had started with 12 men and arrived with 3, and the mathematics of that was not something I was going to resolve in the next few hours or the next few years. I made my report. I made it to a duty captain at the garrison who wrote it down in the prescribed form. Contact with heretic column, engagement, casualties, disposition of prisoners. I said I had encountered an anomalous heretic operation in the northern forest. I said the details were complex and recommended handling by the church's intelligence branch. I gave the coordinates of the Sarpola marsh engagement and the approximate location of the camp where the night attack had occurred. I did not include the clearing. I did not include the loop in the geometry. I did not include the 60 seconds on the rise. Reports are read by people who were not there. Words change the shape of what happened into something bearable, something that fits in the categories that exist, the boxes that the army and the church have constructed to manage the unmanageable. I did not want this made bearable. I did not want it fitted into a box. I wanted it to remain the size it was, uncontained, so that I did not lose track of the scale of what had been born in that forest. The brass noted, in the weekly operational summary, that a significant heretic force had been destroyed in the northern bog country. It was listed as a tactical success, a small victory in a long war. I read the summary and thought about 60 seconds on a rise in the moonlight and a thing the size of a farmhouse testing its weight against the earth. I did not correct the record. Mikael survived. He had 3 weeks in the garrison infirmary with the fever running through whatever the cage had put into him, and when it broke, he was thinner and quieter, and had stopped asking questions, which was perhaps the infection's most lasting effect. He came back to the patrol eventually, He was still one of the best soldiers I have served with. We have not discussed what happened. We will not discuss it. There are things that exist between soldiers who have survived the same thing that do not require discussion and are not made better by it. Paavo died in the camp. I know this because there was no Paavo on the rise. I did not find his body, which is a thing I live with in the way that soldiers learn to live with things they cannot resolve, by not resolving them, by carrying them as weight that is part of the load and not a problem to be set down. I filed for the patrol's deaths in the standard form. Missing in action, Northern Patrol Circuit, July 1914. The garrison priest said the words over their names, and I stood at attention and meant the prayer, which is what you could do when the body was not available for the full rite. I still ride north. This is not courage. It is the nature of the work, and I am constituted for the work, and I do not know what I would be without it. I ride the circuit, the bog country and the pine forest, and the approach routes to the Hellgate perimeter, and I string the icons on Hela's bridle every evening and say the litany in Paavo's flat northern Finnish cadence that I have borrowed without meaning to over 11 years of hearing it. Hela's wounds, from proximity to the Hellgate, the discoloration around her eyes, the occasional tremor in her left foreleg, are worse than they were before July. The garrison farrier says it is nothing and recommends more icons. I have bought more icons. The Amalgam is out there. I know it completed its birth. It was already far beyond the point of interruption when I watched it from the rise. I know it is somewhere in the forest north of Turku, somewhere between the old logging country and the Hellgate perimeter, and I know it is patient in the way that things which have passed through a long process of becoming are patient, because the urgency of transformation is behind them. I know it is growing, because that is what amalgams do. Because the black grail in the infected bodies and insects and animals and everything else that was drawn into it at its birth continues the process of assimilation, and the thing grows, and what it grew from determines what it grows into. And what it grew from was a vessel that was not human to begin with, whatever human form it had worn. I know it has my name. I cannot explain this with the precision I would prefer. What I know is that the moment in the cold camp, the eye contact across the fire, left something in me that was not there before, some mark, some registration, some note in whatever record the thing keeps of the world it moves through. I know this the way I know the Marbendil come for horses in the corrupted water. Not from direct observation of mechanism, but from the accumulated weight of what has happened and what has not happened, and what, by the logic of the situation, is inevitable. I do not know when it will come. I know that it will. I am still a Hakkapeliitta. I still ride north. I still pray the evening litany and string the icons and keep my carbine clean and trust the quality of my horse and the quality of the men around me and the quality of the faith that has held this line for 600 years in the face of everything the Lord of the Flies has set against it. I do not sleep well. I have not slept well since July. I do not expect to sleep well again.